our final panel, where we'll be discussing women in public policy and political leadership. Our moderator is City of Doral Councilwoman Ana Maria Rodriguez. Our panelists are Carmen Lomelin, Miriam Celaya, Gloria Alvarez, and Joan Ciavano. Welcome, ladies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again for inviting me to moderate the panel this afternoon. I'm honored to be here and wanted to go ahead and introduce the panelists at this time. The first panelist that will be speaking today is Carmen Lomelin. Carmen was the U.S. ambassador to the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, from 2009 through 2014. In 1998, she was appointed to the position as OAS Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Women, the CIM, by Secretary General Cesar Gaviria. She served as CIM Executive Secretary until March of 2009. In that position, she provided guidance and direction to the OAS member states and Permanent Secretariat on hemispheric policy, advancing issues affecting women, particularly in the areas of human rights and gender equality. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Lomelin held the positions of White House liaison for the U.S. Office of Personnel Management and director of that agency's Office of International Affairs. She was an advisor on Hispanic affairs to the White House Office for Women's Initiatives and Outreach. She is a proven leader in Western Hemispheric foreign policy development and implementation. Let's give her a round of applause, and she will speak for a few minutes, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not tech savvy enough to do a PowerPoint, so please bear with me. First of all, Ana Maria, thank you so much for the introduction. I'd like to thank Florida International University, Dr. Mora, and of course the Cuban Human Rights Foundation for hosting this very important event. The work you are truly doing the Lord's work, and I can't tell you how inspired and humbled I am to be here and listening to the really brave women that are day-to-day confronting the challenges to democracy and the challenges to human rights in their countries. I cannot admire them enough, and again, I feel very humbled to be in their presence. We were given the instructions just to talk a little bit about how we got to the political aspects of our life, what led us there, and then how we saw the role of women certainly in foreign policy and in political leadership. I can say one thing: political involvement was probably the last thing on my mind. I grew up in a small steel town outside the city of Chicago. My parents were Mexican immigrants. My first job out of high school was working the midnight shift at the steel mills, typing up invoices, a job that I held for about 7 years. I couldn't go straight to college because, of course, I was a girl. My father was very traditional. I had to work to help support my family. And for a lot of us, this is not unusual. The interesting thing is, when my brother graduated from high school, my father told him, "Hijo, wherever you want to go to college, donde quieras, por favor. I'll work 2 or 3 jobs if I had to." Of course, he didn't want to go to college, which I found interesting. So I put myself through college, going to night school for 14 years, really, to get both of my degrees. And I was on a corporate track. I had gotten an MBA, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'm just going to really rise to the ranks, except it wasn't happening. And I knew I had to make some kind of career change. And this is the change that completely turned my life around. I went to work for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, where I was the director of leadership training Latinos, Latinas on how to get on boards, how to become more active in their communities. But for me, being in that position, I went into the Latino communities in Chicago primarily working with women. I saw the young girls, 14, 15-year-olds, pregnant with other little babies. I saw kids that were dropping out of high school because they weren't being challenged. I saw the fact that our people were working 2 and 3 jobs with very little pay and no insurance and no benefits. And I also saw that there were the political leaders of the city of Chicago making the decisions for my community without any input from my community. So I started working with some of the community organizers and the activists on issues of importance. First and foremost, the importance of voting, the importance of citizenship and voting. I clearly remember one specific case where I was talking to this elderly Mexican lady trying to see if she would get out and vote. And I said, señora, ya está inscrita para las votaciones. No, mija, no puedo, no soy ciudadana. And I said, bueno, ¿dónde nació? Nací en Texas. You know, that's frightening. All her life, she had never participated in the electoral life of this country because she didn't think she was a citizen. So I decided to become very active in politics. Chicago politics is very unique. So it was an interesting experience, and as I learned a lot I just learned a lot. And I think one suggestion I would make to the young people, whatever your political affiliation is, get involved in politics. It is one of the best training grounds. You learn organizing skills, you learn public relations skills, you learn issues development, and you develop a network that will eventually get you where you are, which is how I got into the further political track. I was involved locally in a lot of political races, but then I became one of the first people involved in the early Clinton campaign, the first one. And I met Hillary Clinton and traveled with her during the first campaign. And I very soon became in the community, the Latina that a lot of people came to for advice. I didn't really know much of anything, but I never let them know. When President Clinton was elected, I was asked to come out to Washington to serve in his administration and was appointed to work in the White House Women's Office. We developed a very interesting initiative while there. It was called At the Tables, and that was an initiative where people went out into the community, appointees, when they traveled and met with women leaders, not political leaders, community leaders, to get a sense of what people were thinking, what people were saying, what were the definite needs in the community. And that was such a way to really get the pulse of what was going on. After the Clinton administration, and I'm really trying to rush this so everybody gets a chance to talk. After the Clinton administration, I was offered the position of head of the Inter-American Commission of Women for the Organization of American States, an amazing organization with a very long and proud history. And one of the big surprises for me was that the issues that I was dealing with at the commission were the very same issues I was dealing with in the Latino communities in Chicago. Gender discrimination, inequity in pay, lack of access to information, lack of access to justice, human rights violations, civil rights violations, on a much more expanded level, in a much broader level, but they were the same. And we spent a lot of time working particularly on gender-based violence. It is rampant in the region. It is rampant throughout the world. Still, after all this discussion, after all these conventions, after all these promises on the parts of governments, we still have very serious problems. I was speaking just last week in New York with the head of an organization called Equality Now. And it's a global women's human rights organization. And she was telling me she was talking about the issues with some of the Middle Eastern countries. And she told me that what they're seeing here in the United States is a sharp increase in the cases of female genital mutilation in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that is probably one of the most extreme forms of violence that can be perpetrated on any young woman. So the challenges still remain. Now, I certainly am speaking to the choir. You are all very well versed on a lot of the actions that are being taken, a lot of the work that's being done in this particular area. But I think one of the encouraging things is that we are seeing the women stepping up to the plate, women demonstrating their leadership and taking on the very, very difficult issues in their country. There's been a lot more participation at the political level. Obviously, right now, there are 5 women heads of state: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. But we're also seeing an increase in political involvement at the local levels. For example, 25% of elected officials in parliaments and legislatures are women, 25% in city councils, 24% in the high courts, and 11.7% at the mayoral level. So we're getting there. It's a lot of work, and there are a lot of challenges still remaining. I think you can make the case that perhaps the quota laws in a lot of countries are having a positive impact. Research shows that 30% participation of women is the critical mass to really create change and impact legislation and build coalitions to move legislation forward. So there are 12 countries in the region that have electoral quotas for women. 30% is pretty much the average. Costa Rica, on the other hand, has the highest quota, 40%, which I think is admirable. And I think the reason women do get involved when they get involved are very personal reasons. They see that there's something wrong in their community. There is something wrong in their city or in their state. The schools are bad. They want better schools for their children, access to jobs, all the social issues that really propel a woman into a political life. And I think, especially my colleagues that have worked on these issues for all these years, is that women have a different way to approach certain issues. I was in Nicaragua a few years back. We were doing a project on basically gender-based budgeting. Small town in Nicaragua. And what they did, the process was very interesting. They took the men and the women, and they trained them and taught them what a budget is, how it works, what it means for a local community. Then they separated the men and the women to get their feedback. They asked the men, if you could have a say-so in how the budget's spent, what would you do? What would you want? The men responded. They wanted soccer fields. They wanted more recreation. They wanted lights for their soccer fields. The women wanted better schools. They wanted paved roads so their feet wouldn't get cut up when they went to the mills to grind their corn. They wanted hot houses, viveros you call them, I think, greenhouses, so they could grow flowers, sell them, make money, and help support their families. Big difference, big difference. I think in looking at where we are politically in political leadership with women in the region, there are challenges and bright spots. Recently, an article by Jolynn Shoemaker of CSIS, she highlighted some of the recent challenges rather. Having, and this is an important point, sometimes we grumble about it, but it's true, having some key female figures in highly visible, powerful roles hasn't really solved the female underrepresentation problem. I think it's fair to say that women in positions of leadership don't necessarily have a gender perspective. We hope they do, we expect that they do, but they sometimes don't. Women, personal challenges, women still have the primary responsibility for the home. I'm always amused when they ask a woman politician, well, how are you going to balance, your job and raising a family? I have yet to hear anybody ask that of a man. They just don't. The work-life concerns exist, inflexible schedules, really oftentimes unrelenting travel, constant pressure to be in the office and busy and working are pretty common features of some of these positions, and the jobs that will get you to the positions certainly in the foreign policy world. And there is burnout. A lot of these jobs are very demanding. You work very long hours with very little recognition. And one other key point is the lack of sponsorship or mentorship. Women, they do recognize the need for advocates, for mentors that'll open the door, but it also doesn't often happen. But the male colleagues always seem to have somebody that's shepherding them through, that's providing them, after work guidance or guidance on the golf course on, you should meet this person, or let me introduce you, or you might want to take this direction. I think that's where we have a lot more work to do. Some of the bright spots, I think, that we can be glad for, and I've got a couple minutes left, is the collective influence of women leaders. For example, at a recent UN meeting, there was the call to action on gender equality on the 20th anniversary of Beijing, really where the women heads of state got together to demand action of the governments. Other examples, in the year 2000, the Declaration of Mexico on Security in the Americas that for the first time looked at the social aspects and the impact of women facing serious security challenges in the region. And also the Inter-American Democratic Charter. There is a clause that talks about participation of women in democracies. That particular piece was put in by a former Salvadoran ambassador to the OAS, Margarita Escobar, a terrific woman. They were done with the negotiations, and she made them reopen that document to make sure that there was some kind of statement on women. I think if listening to the presentations, I think it's very clear that we need to teach our young women. And I think it was one of the speakers that talked about, from Cuba, that talked about how she talks to her children about what she's doing and why she's doing. We need to do that more with our young women. I think we need to get them away from Barbie dolls and beauty pageants and focus a little bit more on the realities of life and their role in impacting society. With that, I'll stop, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Our next speaker is Miriam Zelaya. Miriam continues to write her politically oriented blog, Sin Evasión, Without Evasion, in her home country of Cuba, despite the potential legal ramifications. Her blog, started in 2008, is a forum where she addresses the political, social, and ideological challenges confronting the country. She also discusses the problems of other countries, such as Haiti, that face similar issues as Cuba. Zelaya works on the editorial board of the magazine Consenso, which is Consensus, with other political activists, as well as the digital magazine Con Todos, which is used to support the promotion of civil society in Cuba, and contains links to its writers' blogs, such as Zelaya's Sin Evasión and Yoani Sanchez's Generation Y, Generación Y.
Sí. Una pequeñitas enmiendas que debo hacer.
I need to clarify some things. The Consensus magazine was at the beginning 2004. It was like a magazine that we used to do together, but later on it was called Con Todo. We stopped doing. Giovanni was the webmaster of the magazine, and I was collaborating. It was 6 or 7 people
que escribíamos y éramos el consejo de redacción de esa revista.
The editorial department of that magazine. I was in a position in 2001 to 2002, and my blog with Sin Evasión,
a principios de enero de 2008
in 2008 because it was hacked in December and all the pages were lost. And I just can tell you what it was visible, and it was hacked not long ago as well. And at the present time, we are in repair. I want to renew that, and I want to add certain sections because you're going to look for it now. Right now, it's in terrible condition. So I usually collaborate with 14.5.com with Cubanet. Over here, I have also collaborated with Diario de Cuba, Encuentro magazine, and with several digital media. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a journalist, so I feel a citizen journalist. And after clarifying that,
Quiero empezar agradeciendo estar aquí. Me siento realmente privilegiada, ya lo decía, de haber sido invitada a participar acá. Podrían haber venido otras muchísimas cubanas. Ha habido muchas cubanas acá activistas que son mis compañeras de ruta, las quiero y las admiro mucho. Y bueno, compartir espacio con ellas también me honra mucho. Si algo bueno tiene estar en el último panel es que ya se ha dicho tanto que me permite hacer una especie de... He estado meditando y reflexionando en el mejor sentido sobre todo lo que hemos estado hablando acá y sobre todo la situación cubana. Yo había preparado cuando se me invitó una ponencia enorme, después preparé un PowerPoint y después sencillamente renuncié a todo eso. Le estaba diciendo que yo prefería estar más bien en un tono coloquial, conversacional sobre Cuba, porque hay cuestiones que me preocupan y que son raigales. Una, me parece que es probado el liderazgo, la capacidad de liderazgo que tiene la mujer cubana. En las condiciones actuales lo estamos viendo. Las activistas están creciendo, el activismo de las mujeres en la sociedad civil independiente está creciendo de manera acelerada. Sin embargo, yo quiero llamar la atención sobre algo, y es sobre la responsabilidad que entraña que por una vez en nuestra historia ese liderazgo no sea circunstancial, porque nos lo han arrebatado muchas veces. Y estaba tomando unas notas de esto para que tengamos en cuenta, porque los pueblos son, entre otras cosas, memoria, y tendemos a olvidar el pasado o a ignorar el pasado, sobre todo cuando ha habido un proceso de más de 50 años que se ha empeñado en reescribir la historia y en omitir muchos pedazos de nuestra historia. Yo había tomado, yo creo que sí existe ahora mismo un liderazgo, pero tengo la impresión de que está siendo un liderazgo muy bueno, muy positivo de la mujer, espontáneo, y el desafío es que pase a ser un liderazgo consciente. Un liderazgo consciente. A mí me resulta a veces curioso que me inviten a algún evento donde se debe hablar de una cuestión de género, porque francamente, cuando a mí me han preguntado en alguna entrevista, ¿qué sientes tú como mujer, qué sé yo? Yo digo, bueno, es que a mí no se me ocurre levantarme por las mañanas y decir, yo soy una mujer, ¿qué pienso como mujer? Estoy segura que los hombres tampoco. Los hombres no hacen eso. O sea, yo no pienso como mujer, yo pienso como ciudadana, como un individuo libre. Yo no sé lo que habría que pensar como mujer. No sé. Eso me resulta un poco cuesta arriba, ¿no? Entenderlo. Pero sí me gusta participar en eventos de género porque me permite también ver mis propias limitaciones, ver cuánto nos queda por hacer, y también me estimula mucho ver qué hemos hecho, lo que hemos hecho, ¿no? Los pequeños logros que hemos tenido. Yo voy a hacer un recuentico, porque ¿qué pasa? Nosotros ahora mismo decimos, bueno, hemos logrado esto, hemos logrado lo otro, sí, pero es preciso conocer cuánto hemos perdido y nos queda por recuperar, porque nosotros tenemos una cultura de profundo arraigo patriarcal, pero las mujeres somos las guardianas de este mundo patriarcal, porque somos las que le transmitimos esos valores a nuestros hijos. Usualmente lo hacemos, bueno, algunas no lo hacemos, pero la mayoría de las mujeres cubanas lo hacemos, y otras latinoamericanas también, pero bueno, estoy hablando desde nuestra propia parte. Ahora, en esta comparación en cuánto hemos perdido, voy a hacer un paneo rapidito, porque realmente somos muchas las que vamos a hablar acá y no quiero robar mucho tiempo. Yo había tomado algunas notas en lo que estaba sentada ahí. Por ejemplo, la mujer. Bueno, imagínense, las guerras de independencia en el siglo XIX, 1868. Ana Betancourt participó en la Constituyente de Weimar, la primera constitución de la República en armas. Y ella planteó ahí que cuando hubiera in arms, and she proposed that when there was a republic, the rights of women had to be legally acknowledged. That is never said, and most women ignore that, and that was being ignored, and the rights of women became acknowledged in 1940, the Constitution of 1940. We have inherited historical precedents that show us that all that existed, but it was never consolidated. It never became a reality in Cuban society. When things that we're experiencing now, we have to understand these are consequences of something. A friend tells me, Fidel Castro is not the cause, but the consequence of what we are. And I think that this is quite a significant logic. I said in the Second War of Independence, Feminine Club, that supported Martí and the Revolutionary Party, they developed in such a way that became 37% of the clubs that contributed to the organization of the War for Independence. 37%. However, women at the meetings were represented by men because they could not do it on their own. It's bad that it happened like that, but it was the 19th century. In the Republic, many legally oriented movements had a part. We had panels here. It says some just agree we're there. Cuban women were not really doing badly, but the problem is that in 1959 we had achievements that many countries did not have. Even developed countries in the world we had already reached. We Cuban women had movements. There were feminist legalist movements, but also for social reivindications, for the right of having a time for maternity leave. Women were capable of supporting policies. For instance, the right to vote was achieved because Machado had promised he did not fulfill his promise. Was when in 33-34, when he was off power, there was a clause for women to vote, and that was done. Divorce was approved in Cuba in 1918. Something like that in 1916, a law was passed for women to manage their own property. That was something singular, very specific, anywhere in Latin America and anywhere in the world. In 1925, the number of women that graduated in the University of Havana was the same as those graduated in the U.S. Another very specific piece of data, and I was talking with some friends at the foundation about this. There is a precedent, a very important one, a very interesting one, about the Damas de Blanco, who were the Damas de Negro, the ladies in black, in 1912, when the War of 1912, when an independent party was attempted to be created of black people, that was not was allowed. And there was a great killing, about 5,000 killings between blacks and mestizos. And the rest, many went to jail, and the wives and family members, these black and mestizo women, organized themselves and marched through the streets, organized meetings and so forth for the liberation, freedom of their husbands and spouses. And they were called the ladies in black. I don't think that even the ladies in white know that there is that precedent in the history of Cuba. And with this, I am telling you, those things were done, were lost, history were not acknowledged in history. We always run the risk that one day we attain democracy in Cuba and that women lose this achievements that they achieved on their own rights. I am saying when the revolution comes, so I don't say that the revolution has triumphed because things would not be in this calamitous state as they are now. Of course, Fidel Castro created the Federation of Women, Cuban Women, and he demanded that all the other publications and clubs such as Revista Minerva and others, Tertulia, literary meetings and all that disappeared, and this was monopolized by power and subordinated to the ideological interests of that class in power, that male class, macho male that comes from war and that dominates and controls. Why? Because Fidel knew the power women knew. And why did women stop being aware of that power? When Fidel Castro assaulted the Moncada garrison and was arrested, he was liberated under amnesty, and in great part because of the movement of women that defended them, those that had been arrested. And they were free before the 2 years were over. He said, well, women are powerful. I have to control them as well. Power had to be full power. And by the 50s in Cuba, frankly, a process took place of incorporating women to work in public spaces, working out in the street, as we say in Cuba. We had this quite actively. However, when women attained the right to vote in the Constitution of 1940, they lost that opportunity to do it as it should have been done. What is happening now? Seeing all this that is happening within our civic movement, within Cuba, civic resistance, the ladies in white, librarians, journalists, all that work in this independent civil society, we have to develop that capacity for leadership. We have to be capable of, once reached democracy, to keep that protagonism in Cuba and, as I said at the beginning, going from that spontaneous, circumstantial leadership to one that is a conscious one that has to come from our own cultural roots, change all that and consolidate ourselves as leaders and co-protagonists of that Cuban, democratic Cuba that we want. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Miriam. Our next speaker is Gloria Alvarez. Gloria became an icon for the anti-populist movement following her speech at the first Ibero-American Youth Parliament last fall in Zaragoza, Spain. The video of her presentation went viral, registering more than 1 million views within days. Since then, she has been to Uruguay and Argentina to discuss her thesis that all of Latin America's economic and human rights issues are not to be blamed on the former colonial power, and that populism can be dismantled through technology. Alvarez is a political scientist, a radio broadcaster, and project director at the National Civic Movement of Guatemala, the MCN, an NGO that advocates for the participation of an informed, responsible, and active citizenry in national politics.
Gracias. Muchísimas gracias. Para mí es un honor el poder estar entre mujeres que realmente son admirables y han dado una lucha que yo estoy consciente que hay mujeres en mi país con mejores condiciones que no harían pero ni la mitad. Voy a empezar con una anécdota personal antes de entrar a mi tesis, y es el hecho de que yo nací de un error. Mi papá y mi mamá, de hecho, antes de que yo naciera ya se habían peleado fuertemente, y mi mamá llamaba mucho a la casa preguntando por mi papá, y mi papá decía, dile que no estoy. Pero mi abuela, que en paz descanse, una cienfueguera, era muy inteligente, y le dijo a mi papá, oye, me contesta el teléfono a esa muchacha porque yo creo que está embarazada. Y heme aquí. Entonces, pues mis padres se casaron. Mi madre viene de un círculo de violencia intrafamiliar muy fuerte. Ella fue víctima de lo que son muchas mujeres en América Latina, de un machismo donde tanto su mamá como su papá le pegaban. Y ella, como muchas de las mujeres en América Latina, habiendo aprendido eso, era lo que ella me inculcó a mí. Yo sufrí mucha violencia física y psicológica por parte de mi mamá. Y mi mamá extorsionaba a mi papá con el divorcio y le decía, si tú te divorcias, los niños me los van a dar a mí. Y mi papá, pues con esa presión, permaneció con ella hasta los 16 años. Vivir con una mujer como mi madre era vivir con el reflejo de lo que pasa con las mujeres en América Latina cuando la vida, la familia, les matan las esperanzas. Era una mujer que se levantaba desde las 7 de la mañana para estar absolutamente amargada y pensando que la culpa de todo lo que iba mal era de alguien más menos de ella. Finalmente, a los 16 años tienen una pelea ellos dos, y yo soy la que le saca las maletas y le dice, listo, te vas, porque no se puede ir contigo. Un día mi mamá me llamó porque yo pasé 3 años sin hablarle y me dijo, Gloria, tú tenés que entender de dónde vengo yo, y a ti Dios te va a castigar por no perdonar a tu mamá. Entonces yo le dije, no mami, no te confundas, yo te tengo perdonada porque yo no puedo vivir con algo así en mi corazón, pero lo que yo no puedo hacer es algún día tener una hija y levantarle la mano diciéndole, yo te hago esto porque a mí tu abuela me pegaba. Ese círculo hay que cortarlo. Y es un círculo de violencia donde las mujeres hemos entrado nosotras mismas a ser nuestras peores enemigas. A mí, quien me rescató en ese sentido fue obviamente mi padre, pero también mis abuelos cubanos. Mi abuela era una cienfueguera, nacida en 1923, que la última vez que visitó Cuba fue en el verano de 1960, erradicó su vida en Guatemala, y siendo ella muy tradicional, ama de casa, jamás, pero jamás, ni a mi prima ni a mí, se nos inculcó que lo que debíamos hacer era casarnos y empezar a tener hijos, o que no podíamos tener sueños. Mis abuelos inculcaron en mí el amor por la lectura. Inculcaron en mí que había una isla donde había un barbudo que no dejaba a la gente ser libre y había tarjetas de racionamiento. Mi abuelo era un radioaficionado que se dedicó a sacar gente de Cuba y ayudarla. A través de eso se involucró en cuanta causa social pudo, y creo que eso me pegó a mí muy fuerte desde pequeña para pelear en contra de las injusticias. Y yo creo que las mujeres en América Latina necesitamos rescatar nuestras repúblicas. Y les voy a explicar por qué. A lo largo de la historia, a las mujeres se nos han privado nuestros 3 derechos fundamentales. Nuestros 3 derechos fundamentales son nuestra vida, con la cual nacemos, nuestra propiedad privada, que empieza por nuestro cuerpo y por nuestra mente. Sin nuestro cuerpo, las mujeres ni los hombres pudiéramos funcionar en este mundo tridimensional. Y nuestra mente es como un software que se prende el día que nacemos. Y a partir del día que nacemos, las mujeres empezamos a recolectar conversaciones, vivencias, historias, libros, películas, alegrías, muertes, desafíos. Y el día que morimos, ese software se apaga. Y en cada una de nosotras, ese software es diferente. Porque cada quien sabe qué es lo que tiene en su mente y las cosas que ha podido recolectar en la vida. Con esas 2 propiedades privadas, cuerpo y mente, cualquier individuo en este mundo es capaz de alcanzar cualquier sueño, siempre y cuando también se le garantice la libertad. Porque de nada sirve nacer, estar vivo, tener cuerpo, tener mente, para que física o psicológicamente te pongan una cadena con una pelota de hierro y no te puedas mover, no puedas viajar, no te puedas expresar, no puedas trabajar y no puedas construir. Pero a lo largo de los siglos, a las mujeres se nos fue privada la vida. Y la vida era algo que se terminaba cuando una mujer trataba de salirse del molde tradicional y luchar por sus propios sueños. Desde Juana de Arco hasta Amelia Earhart, tuvimos mujeres que fueron condenadas a la muerte, al ostracismo y a cualquier otra cosa por expresar su opinión o tener sueños más altos de lo que los hombres les permitían tener, o incluso otras mujeres. Nuestras libertades, lo que dice Miriam es verdad. Cuba iba a pasos agigantados cuando en un país como el mío, Guatemala, las mujeres no pudieron votar sino hasta 1945, mucho menos acumular propiedad privada. Y acceder a un trabajo era impensable, porque el trabajo de una mujer era casarse y reproducirse, y se acabó. Y por último, la libertad para soñar, para expresarse, para votar incluso. Entonces las mujeres a lo largo de los siglos fuimos privadas de los 3 derechos fundamentales que como individuos una república nos da. Y aprendimos a vivir bajo eso. Aprendimos las mujeres a ser tan astutas que incluso manejamos la política, la economía y la cultura dentro de la sociedad, susurrándole a los hombres en el oído lo que ellos debían hacer, con tal de nosotras no perder nuestro espacio. Desde los emperadores romanos hasta la actualidad, vemos que la mujer siempre ha estado ahí, opinando y dando a conocer sus puntos de vista en aquellos lugares donde fue oprimida. Pero mientras unas avanzábamos en eso, otras avanzamos por otro camino, y algunas nos hemos vuelto más machistas que los machos. En mi país es común, cuando se parte un pollo en la mesa, decir la pechuga para el nene, la alita y la patita para la nena, porque el que se tiene que alimentar es el hombre. Nena, vaya a hacerle la cama al hermano, lávele los platos, retire de la mesa, y al nene no. Entonces nos damos cuenta que el machismo, la violencia intrafamiliar y la diferenciación empieza de madres, abuelas a hijas, no tanto de hombres, porque si realmente el machismo fuera cuestión de hombres, ya todos se hubieran quedado solos. Y serían ellos un club de machos donde nadie más entraría. Pero la verdad de la realidad es que nosotras mismas somos parte de ese círculo psicológico que continúa aplaudiendo el machismo y la misoginia. Al pasar estos siglos privadas de nuestros derechos y al volvernos más machistas que los machos, las mismas madres han tergiversado la escala de principios y valores universales. No todas las madres les enseñan a sus hijos la igualdad de derechos. No todas las madres les enseñan a sus hijas que la vida, la libertad y la propiedad privada son sagradas en cualquier persona, porque ellas tampoco han aprendido eso. Y cuando multiplicamos ese efecto en millones y millones de latinoamericanos, nos encontramos con sociedades que casi que se ponen en una bandeja de plata para que venga el primer populista a manipularlas, a someterlas y a quitarles su libertad. 50 Shades of Grey o películas como Twilight y este tipo de libros, aunado a un pasado machista y misógino, es lo peor que le podemos hacer a las mujeres por una sencilla razón. Este tipo de películas o de literatura le enseñan a las mujeres que ellas pueden ser una babosa más, una taradita más, sin personalidad, plana, sin ningún sueño en la vida, y va a captar la atención de nada más y nada menos que un galán de primera categoría, culto, historiador, que toca el piano, que es millonario y que tiene miles de excentricidades. Le estamos vendiendo a las mujeres que sin tener carácter, ni visión, ni profesión, ni personalidad, ni sueños, ni carisma, van a encontrar al hombre de su vida. Y esa es la mentira más grande que hay. Porque si una mujer quiere un hombre inteligente, primero ella tiene que ser inteligente. Porque si una mujer busca un hombre con principios, con valores y con excentricidades, ella primero tiene que ser un alma que huele libre para pintar, cantar, escribir literatura, trabajar en un periódico, ser médica o ser lo que ella quiera. A mayor excentricidad y a mayores ángulos tenga una persona, es más fácil que otras personas de su misma vibra se fijen en ella. Pero lo que le estamos vendiendo a la mujer del siglo XXI es peor que el sueño americano de 1950. Porque lo que le estamos diciendo es, ya no necesitas que tu familia te case con alguien. Tú solita, sin ser nadie en la vida, vas a llamar la atención del hombre más guapo, más millonario, más excéntrico y más todo. Es un mensaje terrible. Y la verdad es que si no tenemos mujeres con carácter, con sueños, con pasión, con ganas de vivir, en las familias se va a empezar a trasladar que los hijos no tengan todas esas cosas. En mi país, Guatemala, hay 3 cosas que impiden que las mujeres pidan sus derechos y los exijan. La primera es la violencia intrafamiliar. Solo por darles una estadística, en el año 2014, 2008 niñas de 9 a 14 años de edad fueron violadas y embarazadas por sus mismos padres y tíos. En un país que se dice 95% cristiana la gente, está pasando esto. Y por ese mismo conservadurismo tradicional, la educación sexual es impensable en las escuelas. Pero no importa que haya 2008 niñas de 9 a 14 años que ya hoy son mamás de otro montón de criaturas. La segunda es la desnutrición crónica. De cada 50 niños desnutridos en mi país, 49 son desnutridos crónicos. Este tipo de desnutrición no se da por falta de alimentos, sino por consumir alimentos que no tienen ningún nutriente. Pero vemos a mujeres como Roxana Valdetti, mi actual vicepresidente, o Sandra Torres, la ex primera dama que ahora quiere ser candidata a la presidenta, regalando una cosa que se llama bolsa solidaria, lo cual contiene masa y grasa, frijol, maíz, harina y ya está. Y aceite en algunos casos. Con ese tipo de alimentación, no solo 50 de cada 100 niños menores de 5 años está desnutrido crónicamente, sino que las mujeres en mi país, el 65% son obesas y anémicas, con sobrepeso y sin vitaminas. Porque a nadie, a esas mujeres les está enseñando a cocinar un plato balanceado entre verduras, proteínas y frutas. La tercera cosa es el machismo y la misoginia. Tener los propios ingresos para una mujer implica la muerte en Guatemala. Porque que un hombre sea mantenido por su mujer es lo peor visto. Y lo más interesante es que se ha demostrado que de cada $10 que una mujer gana, 9 los reinvierte en el hogar. Mientras el hombre de cada $10 que gana, 3 los reinvierte en el hogar. Entonces, tener a una mujer que trabaja y que produce incluso es mejor para la familia, pero en mi país no se ve así, y es el único en Centroamérica donde los sueldos no se han equiparado entre uno y otro. Cuando yo propuse desmantelar el populismo a través de la tecnología, también propongo que cada mujer vea su smartphone, su tablet, su computadora o aunque sea el café internet que hay en la aldea como su mejor aliado. La magia del teléfono inteligente es que aunque una mujer esté en una situación de violencia, de abuso, es privado. Es algo que es entre ella y su teléfono, entre ella y la tecnología. Y a través de este aparato, esa mujer puede aprender a cocinar la comida balanceada que su niño desnutrido necesita. Esa mujer puede aprender cuidados médicos, puede tecnificarse en una profesión, puede encontrar una manera de salir adelante, aun si está en esos círculos de opresión. Esa intimidad que la mujer puede despertar con la tecnología para ella misma empoderarse es crucial y fundamental, y yo considero es la herramienta más factible que tenemos en América Latina para sacarlas adelante. Nos faltan mujeres liberales, eso sí. Nos sobran mujeres socialistas. Y cuando digo liberales me refiero al liberalismo clásico o libertarianism, porque yo sé que aquí en Estados Unidos se entiende liberal por demócrata. No. Nos hacen falta mujeres liberales en el aspecto del liberalismo clásico. Todas las mujeres que ingresan a política son socialistas y se vuelven referentes de otras mujeres no por su ideología, sino por ser mujeres. Entonces, no solo estamos envenenando a las niñas con Twilight y 50 Shades of Grey, sino que les decimos que por ser mujer, ¿qué importa su política? Lo que importa es que es mujer. Y eso nos ciega de ver las consecuencias que estas mujeres líderes están teniendo. Y cuando hablo de líderes socialistas, me refiero a Hillary Clinton, a Dilma Rousseff, a Angela Merkel, a Eva Perón, a Cristina Kirchner, a Michelle Bachelet, a Camila Vallejo. Resulta que la única mujer liberal que tenemos es Margaret Thatcher. Y la misma es demonizada en América Latina por algo que no tiene nada que ver con ser mujer ni ser liberal, que fueron las Malvinas. Entonces tú a una mujer latina no le puedes poner a la Thatcher de ejemplo porque no te la traga. Y la verdad es que el ejemplo de la Thatcher tiene ya que renovarse, porque ella es una mujer producto de su época, de los años 80. Con sus virtudes y defectos tuvo una gran realidad, que es que cuando llegó al poder se mantuvo fiel a sus principios liberales. Pero aparte de ella no tenemos a nadie más. Y resulta entonces que las mujeres que se ingresan a la política sin estudiar economía, sin realmente analizar todas las posibilidades ideológicas que hay, se nos vuelven socialistas y se las metemos a cucharada a las niñas que vienen de abajo porque por ser mujer y ser política tiene que ser admirada. Y estamos haciendo un daño terrible, porque entonces la meritocracia, que es que las personas valgan por su mérito, se disminuye y se enaltece el hecho de que por ser mujer todo lo que hace está bien. Una madre que realmente busca el bienestar de sus hijos, pienso yo, debe luchar por la república, porque la república es el único sistema que concibe al individuo como la minoría más pequeña. Es decir, la república entiende que la minoría más pequeña que existe es cada uno de nosotros, y cada uno de nosotros merecemos el respeto y la garantía de nuestros 3 derechos: vida, libertad y propiedad. Al luchar por la República, la mujer está luchando porque sus hijos tengan igualdad de oportunidades. También debe luchar por el mercado libre y no por el mercado controlado. Una madre, una tía o una abuela que quiera ver que sus futuras generaciones sean independientes tiene que pelear por la libertad de mercado, porque solo el mercado libre atrae oportunidades a granel para los jóvenes. Un Estado que controla la economía está esclavizando a las futuras generaciones. Y por eso las mujeres, que son al final y al cabo el pilar de la educación familiar, tienen que defender esas cosas con todas las agallas. Y la tercera cosa por la que las mujeres en América Latina deben de luchar es por la unión de Latinoamérica y de sus mujeres en pro de la educación, sobre todo 2 tipos de educación: la educación reproductiva y sexual, para que cada mujer en este continente entienda cómo funciona su cuerpo y pueda decidir ser madre cuando ella quiere ser madre y no cuando le impongan ser madre, y la administración presupuestaria de sus ingresos. Toda mujer en América Latina debería de saber que no es tanto la cantidad que le ingresa, sino cómo administra lo que le ingresa. Si algún día queremos latinoamericanas que dejen de buscar el marido millonario que las mantenga, primero tenemos que independizarlas. Y para independizarlas tenemos que hacerles ver los beneficios del ahorro y de manejar un presupuesto adecuado. Por último, hay una cosa que yo estoy manejando en mi conferencia, que es el círculo del victimismo que lleva al populismo. Yo creo que el mayor problema del populismo no es la economía ni la política, ni los desastres institucionales que está dejando. Yo creo que el mayor problema del populismo es psicológico, porque nos está dejando con generaciones desempoderadas que sienten que no pueden salir adelante. Y el círculo del victimismo empieza con una educación de victimismo. Cuando las madres mandan a sus hijos a la escuela, se garantizan de que la niña lleve el lunchbox con la mejor comida, de que el niño vaya con la mochila del superhéroe del año para que no le hagan bullying, o cuando se van a graduar de high school, nos encargamos de que la niña vista el mejor vestido más elegante y que el chico lleve la corbata más linda. Pero ¿cuántas madres de familia en América Latina abren el libro de historia de quinto primaria, sexto primaria de sus hijos para ver víctimas de qué los están haciendo? Porque en el caso de Guatemala, en los libros de historia se les enseña a los niños a ser víctimas, como en Cuba se les adoctrina para ser revolucionarios. En mi país se les enseña que vinieron a un país que es víctima y que vinieron a este mundo a sufrir, y que la culpa de todo es de los españoles, de los yanquis, de los empresarios, de la oligarquía. Cuando un niño crece con mentalidad de víctima, tiene baja autoestima. No se siente capaz de comerse el mundo, no se siente capaz de cumplir sus sueños. Y la gente con baja autoestima es insegura en sí misma. ¿Aplico o no aplico al trabajo? ¿Me voy o no me voy a estudiar a otro país? ¿Temo o no tomo esta oportunidad? Con gente insegura tenemos también gente que le tiene pánico a tomar riesgos. Es gente que agarrando el dinero de su bolsa para invertirlo en una empresa le parece algo ridículo, porque si les va mal pierden mucha plata. Entonces tenemos gente educada en el victimismo, con baja autoestima, insegura en sí misma, incapaz de tomar riesgos, menos riesgos financieros. Y eso hace que nadie quiera ser empresario, eso hace que nadie quiera ser emprendedor, pero igual quieren ser ricos, igual quieren tener casas, quieren tener fincas. Entonces, ¿qué pasa con ese círculo? Voltean a ver al gobierno de su país y se les iluminan los ojitos como las maquinitas en Las Vegas de casino, ¿no? ¡Tin, tin, tin! El gobierno se vuelve la mina de oro. Es perfecto. Ingreso a un cargo público, no mejoro mi autoestima, no me ocupo de una mejor educación, sigo inseguro de mí mismo, pero al ingresar a un cargo público, con el dinero de cada uno, monto mi empresa sin tomar ningún riesgo y me vuelvo millonario. Por eso no es de extrañar que en países como el mío, la mayoría de niños quieren ser abogados, porque sueñan con un día llegar a ese lugar para manipular las leyes y enriquecerse con el dinero de otros. Y eso sí, una vez en el poder, este círculo se completa manteniendo la educación rezagada en la década de los 60, como está en mi país, obsoleta y sin darle a los niños las herramientas que necesitan en este siglo XXI. Ese círculo es el que permite que el populismo en nuestros países sea recibido con aplausos, porque son generaciones que buscan enriquecerse no por la vía del esfuerzo personal. Por eso yo creo que las mujeres en América Latina tienen que pelear por las repúblicas, que ya somos en papel, pero no en la práctica, porque no tenemos división de poderes, no tenemos institucionalidad y no tenemos meritocracia que premie a quienes realmente han demostrado una vida honorable. Sin república no hay desarrollo ni progreso, porque solo la república garantiza los derechos individuales y solo un individuo con derechos garantizados puede progresar y puede trabajar y puede acumular riqueza. Si no hay desarrollo ni progreso, resurgen, como resurgió en Cuba, el machismo, la violencia intrafamiliar, la misoginia y la codependencia de la mujer, con patrones pasados que sirvieron a sus madres y abuelas para sobrevivir en un mundo liderado por hombres. Eso es lo que resurge cuando no tenemos desarrollo y progreso y cuando las repúblicas fallan. La pobreza material, señoras, no es la peor de todas. La peor de todas es la pobreza mental. Yo por eso cuando hablo con las mujeres en mi país que no tengan mucho dinero, lo que les digo es, vote por la república, señora, porque con república usted va a tener justicia. Y cuando la asalten, va a haber un policía que se lleve al ladrón. Y cuando venga el marero a extorsionarla todas las semanas al negocio, va a haber un policía que se lo va a llevar. Y cuando su marido se le escape, va a haber un abogado que le haga pagar la pensión por los hijos que usted está manteniendo. Sin república no hay justicia y sin justicia no hay mujeres empoderadas. Y si no hay mujeres empoderadas, no va a haber mujeres emprendedoras que sean las motores en sus casas de la buena educación. Los avances de los que habló Miriam fueron posibles en la Cuba desde principios de siglo hasta los años 50. Y tenemos que voltear a ver a mujeres que en la región están haciendo grandes cambios, como Giovanni Sánchez, como Miriam, como ustedes aquí sentadas, como Pia Mancini y tantos otros ejemplos. Tenemos que enseñarle a las niñas a admirar a las mujeres no por ser mujeres, sino por las cosas que están haciendo en pro de los derechos de la vida, la propiedad y la libertad de las que todas somos partícipes. Se pueden romper los círculos, yo soy testigo de ello, y no hay satisfacción más grande que poder hablar con mujeres como ustedes y venir aquí a aprender tanto de lo que se puede lograr y avanzar. Muchas gracias.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gloria. Our last panelist this afternoon is Joan Caivano. Joan is the Deputy to the President and Director of Special Projects at the Inter-American Dialogue. She directs the Dialogue's project on press freedom issues and its work on women's leadership in the Americas. She manages a range of institutional responsibilities, including the Dialogue's Sol Linowitz Forum, its publications program, outreach to the press, and membership issues. Previously, she worked at the Overseas Development Council and the Brookings Institution, and managed several small business enterprises. She has been a frequent guest lecturer on issues of concern to women in Latin America at the Foreign Service Institute. She holds a master's degree in Latin American Studies from Georgetown University, where she also completed her undergraduate studies.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I also like to thank Frank Mora and Pedro Rodriguez and Florida International University and the Human Rights the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba for the invitation. And I have to say, I think I am the most humbled of anyone by all of the preceding speakers, especially being the last. And I'm going to take my inspiration from Gloria, take a risk, and go through with this, even though she's a hard act to follow, as are the others who preceded me. The title of the panel, my sense of the meeting, led me to organize a presentation about the work that the Dialogue has done. The Inter-American Dialogue works on a range of issues. We have a mission to promote democratic governance, prosperity, and social equity in Latin America. We're made up of 100 members, distinguished citizens throughout the hemisphere. And one of the initiatives that we carried out in the 90s, early 2000s was a network of women leaders, and one of the main goals of that network was to pull together information and put out publications and reports to hold governments accountable to the commitments that they've made to women at international forums and such. And I continue to believe that kind of work is important. The more I speak to women's feminist leaders and NGO operatives throughout the region, I realize how important these international conventions are as tools for them and their work holding their own governments accountable. So today I thought I would talk about the great gains that women have made in politics. This has been obvious now after everyone has spoken, so I'll try to rush through that part. And also the particular successes that we've had in the Department of passing laws, with the caveat always that laws are one thing and implementation is another. But let's start. Oh, and then I will end up with what I consider the unfinished agenda. And I will only focus on reproductive rights, but the other important part of that unfinished agenda, I think, is violence against women. I left that to earlier panels and earlier speakers who certainly covered that topic, but I think reproductive rights needs some attention. It's going to be hard for you to read this, but in any case, this slide traces the progress that women have made in terms of their representation in Congress and in ministerial positions from I think from 2000 through 2015. And it is just spectacular. Now women represent 26% of Congresses in the region. This is above the global average of 22%. Of course, it isn't up to the Nordic percentage of 42%, but it is still much, much better than the United States has accomplished. And it's interesting to see, though, that there is no correlation between success in this democratic advance of having more women and more equity in political representation. There's no correlation between that and the economic development of the countries. So, and also it's interesting to note that women have made these gains in the legislative branches, even at the local level, but not so much in the executive branch, although, again, I think as Carmen said, it is pretty amazing that in our region there have been several women heads of state, which we can't say for most other regions, and certainly not my country. But one of the reasons that, that is one of the factors behind the success of women in the legislative branches are the quota laws. And in fact, there are 16 countries that have passed quota laws. There were 17. Venezuela had passed a quota law in 1998, but it was rescinded when Chavez came to power in 2000. So there are only 2 countries in the region without them, Guatemala and Venezuela. Now, and you'll see, if you can see, the before and after percentages. These laws are effective in some countries and not in others. For example, Costa Rica went from 14% before the law passed to almost 40%. The same with Argentina, from 6 to 40% after the law passed. And they have a law both for the Senate and for the lower house. So what factors explain the discrepancy in success of these laws? Well, there are basically 3. First, the law has to be obligatory, and here we go back to enforcement and implementation. There should be some sort of penalty for not complying with the law. Some of the laws are just suggestions for political parties, but they're not mandatory. Second, they work best in closed-list systems, and in those systems with a greater number of candidates on the list. And finally, to be effective in a closed-list system, there has to be a placement mandate saying where women are placed on those lists. Like in Argentina, for example, every third slot has to be occupied by a woman so that they're not clustered at the bottom where they have no chance of getting elected. And then besides Anyway, besides quota laws, there are other factors that account for women's promotion into power everywhere. One is political parties. They tend to be hierarchical, male-dominated gatekeepers. Any group that's in power generally jealously guards their power to keep outsiders out, and that's women happen to be outsiders in this realm. So political parties need to become more democratic. The media continues to perpetuate gender stereotypes and focus on women's appearance over their substance. Campaign financing, we know women make less money than men. It's harder for them to access credit, so it's harder to finance their campaigns. And then the ubiquitous, talked about a lot, gender role in the family. I mean, that's the hardest nut to crack. It is something that women assume. This is what they want to do. In fact, oftentimes balance both home and career, but it can be made easier with certain public policies. So that remains an issue. And then talking about all of this, this is a quote about the use and importance of quota laws, and I thought it was interesting because some women themselves are not in favor of quota laws because it takes away the sense of a meritocracy. But in any case, in order to get beyond the hierarchical political parties, it seems to be necessary. This is a slide out of order. And then this is the question I wanted to ask: does it matter to have women in power? And I think someone else made reference to this question. And in fact, studies have been done that it does. There is a correlation, not necessarily women in presidential palaces, that isn't enough, but the critical mass of women in legislatures has been correlated to an advance in women's legal rights in a range of areas. We know domestic violence, rape laws. Rape was previously not considered a crime. Sexual and reproductive rights, the reform of discriminatory civil and criminal codes, all important advances that happened from the 80s to the 90s when we saw more women in power. But again, it's not enough. Women owe their primary allegiance to their political parties, to their constituents, to their mentors. So if there's a conflict between the interests of the party and the women's alliances that they may belong to, the party would usually win out. And then I have this slide just to show the countries and the years that violence against women laws were passed. This is an example of a great success story for women in the region. Legal rights in Latin America, with the exception of abortion law, are quite advanced and very progressive. Constitutions, criminal codes, labor law reflect principles of gender equality. But the key challenge, of course, is to implement them. I would say, well, I think I'll get into that a little bit later. But let me see. The other point I wanted to make about violence against women laws is that this topic was not spoken of until quite recently, and I think that's an issue that I want to keep in mind when we turn to reproductive rights, because the fact that the violence against women, domestic violence, became a topic that was discussed in legislative chambers and in the media, it helped push things like violence against women laws, police stations, and other things. Not enough has been done, but it was important to get it out there in the public discourse, and it accounts for some of the success we've seen. And before going on to reproductive rights, which I'd like to talk to it in a little more length, talking about implementation of the law, there are a couple of things to keep in mind that are important. One is that women have to know that they have these rights in order to push for them, in order to bring suits in the courts, and the lawyers who help them have to be, their consciousness has to be raised. They have to respect the arguments that gender rights that you would have to bring, and the judges have to be sensitive to those arguments. Those things, those elements, those factors had been missing for a long time, and I think now they are in place. The women's movements, NGOs have worked a lot to raise the consciousness and training of judges and lawyers. And an important thing, women themselves are entering the legal profession. I mean, more than half of law school classes are comprised of women. I think Carmen mentioned the percentage of judges even at the higher levels. The average percent in Latin America is 23, but many countries have 30 to 40% of their courts are female. The judges in their courts are female, so that's very important. And binding international conventions like CEDAW, like Belém do Pará, these are crucial. They're crucial not only for women's movements, but also when judges use international conventions to make decisions in domestic cases, that really helps to advance women's rights in the country, and those decisions are then referred to by others. It's a virtuous cycle, and it's really important to keep that in mind with these international conventions. And Beijing Plus 20 this year being celebrated is very important to many women's groups that I've spoken to, and we see that these conventions have also been instrumental in advancing reproductive rights in the region. Now, moving to that topic, that's, of course, reproductive rights has to do with health, and I want to say that in the area of health, again, a lot of progress has been made. I won't go into any detail, but certainly women's life expectancy is up at first world levels. Access to contraception, it's not universal and it's not enough, but there have been great advances, with the exception of rural areas and poor women that are dependent upon public hospitals for distribution of contraception. But on the whole, the statistics are going in a positive direction, and maternal mortality is going down. Now, maternal mortality is still a problem in Latin America, but the rates have gone down largely due to an increase in the number of women giving birth in hospitals or with the help of medical professionals, and also the widespread use of misoprostol, which is not legal in most countries, but it's available, and it has reduced the danger of unsafe abortions. But still, unsafe abortions pose a significant risk for many women in Latin America. It's the world's most restrictive region in terms of abortion laws, and those two things go together. Latin America has the highest proportional number of abortions and maternal mortality as a result of unsafe abortions in the world. About 1,100 women, Latin American women, die every year from voluntary abortions, yet abortion is illegal in all but 2 countries, Cuba and Uruguay, with minor exceptions in other countries, but it's still basically not a choice for most women. I won't go through all these stats, but I'll just flip the slides so you can read them. But the evidence of these slides and these statistics is clear that criminalizing abortion does not decrease its practice, nor the incidence of unwanted pregnancy, but it does jeopardize women's lives in terms of their health, their safety, and their economic well-being. So advocates for a change in a reform in reproductive rights laws have been emphasizing the human cost of the total criminalization of abortion. And here's a slide that shows where we are in terms of the laws and the permissiveness and the exceptions that are available to women who are seeking abortions. The one minor change on this, the Dominican Republic has recently, I think it went through their legislature, 3 exceptions to the total ban on abortion, or the president signed something and it still has to be approved by the legislature. It's in progress. It's not there yet, but they will probably move up. And of course, Chile is in the process of making a change to its laws, but we'll see where that ends up. But I want to talk about this issue just as an example, as I said, of the importance of international conventions and use of the media and women's movements aligning with international forces and with other sectors in society like lawyers, doctors, to bring attention to the issue, to change people's understanding, to raise their consciousness of the impact of the issue on women and particularly girls who become pregnant and are faced with the choice of seeking out an illegal and unsafe abortion or going through with a pregnancy, which is unthinkable and for many young women. What I'd like to point out, and there are countries in the region where they previously had allowed therapeutic abortions in the case of a risk to a mother's life, an abnormal fetus, or in the case of rape or incest. There are 3 countries which have reversed those openings and have gone in the other direction, Nicaragua being the most egregious case. And in all 3 of these, we can see the influence of the Catholic Church and the Evangelical Church now in alliance, very, very powerful politically as well as financially. In Nicaragua in 2006, President Ortega, for his own electoral political reasons, entered into a pact with Cardinal Obando y Bravo and the Catholic hierarchy and pushed through a law removing the exceptions so that now Nicaraguan women who have had a very strong base of feminist NGOs and such have no recourse to any exceptions to the total ban on abortion. Likewise, in El Salvador, which once permitted therapeutic abortions, in 1997 eliminated the few exceptions, and then in 1999 they passed a constitutional amendment saying that life begins at conception, which bars any chance of passing a law that would contravene the Constitution. And Chile, which only recently liberalized its ban on divorce, has continued to maintain strict abortion prohibition. In fact, it's a surprise to many people that back in 1931, Chile did have therapeutic abortions written into their constitution, and it was never discussed, but doctors operated on the assumption that, of course, you would save the mother's life if faced with a situation. It's a medical, internationally followed standard. It's not really, so the law wasn't really discussed as such until Pinochet was leaving office in 1989, and as a gift to the Catholic Church, I guess, or to the Christian Democratic Party, passed a law prohibiting all abortions, and that was in 1989. There were attempts to overturn that, actually change the Constitution. There were attempts to overturn that throughout the 90s, but nothing was ever supported by the Concertación, the ruling Concertación for those first couple of decades after the dictatorship. There was a pact between the parties and the church, of course, for the support that the church lent under the dictatorship, and debt was owed, and it was paid by Michelle Bachelet in her first term. She held back from pushing on this issue, although she did push on the morning after pill, pushed so hard she got it through. It was brought to the Supreme Court and contested, I think, on 2 occasions, and the court found in favor of the law that Michelle Bachelet had pushed through. So morning after pill is available in Chile, which is an achievement of her first term, and now we see in January she presented a bill that would allow abortion in 3 cases, save the life of a mother, a malformed fetus, and in the case of rape. It's interesting, her coalition is más o menos supporting it. The Christian Democrats are still resistant to the 3rd exception in the case of rape. They see it as sort of a slippery slope to legalizing abortion. She's not pushing beyond those 3 causes, which makes her not very popular with the feminists who think it's not much of a change from what Chile has now, even though it does, and it is important, it puts into law the fact that there are exceptions available to women, and not only to women of means who can go to private clinics or who can go to Miami. So, and of course, when that was said by the health minister, she lost her job. So that it goes to show that truth cannot be spoken still on this issue without consequences. But there are success stories. Uruguay passed a law that makes abortion available without I say without need for a cause. You do need to go through a bit of rigmarole, and the woman has to go and explain why she wants the abortion, et cetera, but she can get it without having any particular need to prove that her life is in danger. And there are two, and I guess I'm probably out of time, two great cases. I'll say this. If you want to read about these cases and the international conventions that were behind their success, there's an article that you can find on our Inter-American Dialogue's website, but I have some copies here that talks about the different cases that have been brought before international courts, the International Court on Human Rights and the CEDAW, by women, and particularly shocking cases of teenage pregnancies where, girls were denied an abortion and had to carry to term an encephalitic fetus or this or that. There are different cases that have been very shocking, changed public opinion because they were brought to the attention. The media was cooperating, started writing about things that they hadn't written about before. Doctors came out in support of a change to the law. And in the case of Mexico and Colombia, these strategies worked. In Colombia, a lawyer named Monica Roa brought a case to the Constitutional Court saying that Colombia was not living up to its commitment to women made in international conventions to save the life, to protect women's lives. And the Constitutional Court bought that argument and overturned the total ban. In Colombia, it's an interesting judicial strategy which wouldn't work in countries where they don't have such an independent judiciary. And then in Mexico, it went through, Mexico City, I should say, it went through the Mexico City Council, was run by the PRD, the mayor was PRD. So there was, political, it was politically the right time. The bad news is the rest of the country, there was a backlash. 17 provinces of Mexico proceeded to pass Life Begins at Conception amendments to their constitutions. So it's not all a truly happy story, but you can read about those two cases and how they go to show the importance of women's alliances, using the international conventions and working with different sectors of society, and most importantly, the media to get the word out and raise everyone's consciousness. Sorry if I've gone over time, but thank you very much for your attention. And it's been a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Joan. Let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists this afternoon. I just want to say that each of you brought a very unique perspective to this conversation of women in politics, and actually elevated it to another level, and talked about a lot of different things that I wasn't expecting to hear from each of you. So I just want to say I really enjoyed it. I know everyone here is very happy that you all participated. We're hoping to make this an annual event. This is our first conference, so stay tuned for dates for next year's women's conference. We do have a few minutes left for some Q&A. If anyone would like to step up to one of the microphones and present your questions, the panelists will be here a few more minutes, and then we're going to wrap up at 4:15 here in this room. So if any of you have any questions or any just feedback you would like to share with the panelists, I'm sure they would appreciate that at this time. Thank you.
Gloria, I have a question. No en español, porque de verdad que
Gloria, I have a question.
no voy a gastar el inglés.
I'm not going to use up all my English.
Al populismo,
Populism.
populismo,
talking about populism and all the governments, the populists, and the change of constitutions and everything that they have been doing in Latin America.
Una vez establecido,
Once that is established,
¿cómo tú ves el proceso de
what is
darle
the process,
marcha atrás a eso,
So
de
for
volver
that to
a
back
la
up,
república
to
de
go
que tú
back to
hablas?
the
¿Cómo?
republic you're talking
Una
about,
vez que está
once
arraigado,
that is
mira Correa,
embedded
mira
in
el de Nicaragua,
everywhere,
todo
you
esto,
see
se han
Correa,
establecido
Nicaragua, and
como
everything, they have
reyes
established themselves
con
as
vida.
kings for life.
¿Qué proceso tú
What
ves,
is the
cómo tú
process you
ves la
think that
posibilidad
we have
de
the possibility
volver
of
después
establishing
que se
to
ha
go
caído
back
el populismo a
because
una república?
we're this is populism.
Bueno, creo que hay varias estrategias que se están llevando a cabo en los diferentes países. Por ejemplo, en el caso de Nicaragua es un populismo muy particular porque en Nicaragua no hay un solo empresario que ponga un peso por hacer ciudadanía, porque todos están con Ortega y Ortega está en todas las empresas. Entonces, es un caso donde hay un movimiento que se llama Movimiento Unidad de la Gente, que no cuenta con recursos y han logrado organizarse en sectores. Dividieron a Managua en 9 sectores y gente de barrio, gente muy humilde, así albañiles, maestros, carpinteros, se han organizado para empezar a empoderar a los ciudadanos que están ahí, porque mucha de esa gente me dice, mira, mi cuñada, mi tío se han vuelto receptores de la bolsa, del fertilizante, de la lámina y ahora no quieren trabajar. Y entonces la misma gente de abajo se está dando cuenta cómo el populismo al entregar estos bienes materiales está dejando que una población simplemente se cruce de brazos y se haga para atrás, y es de la misma gente en el caso de Nicaragua que está surgiendo el cambio. En el caso de Argentina, con la proliferación de las políticas kirchneristas, 18 organizaciones liberales, en el sentido del liberalismo clásico, se han organizado en lo que ellos llaman Red Liberal, y ahí se aglutinan think tanks, estudiantes, políticos, empresas, que hicieron un frente común, cosa que no habían logrado durante años, para entonces hacer foros, debates, conversatorios, actividades civiles, digamos, que están haciendo despertar al argentino a que existen otras opciones. Y luego eso se aceleró con lo que pasó con el fiscal Nisman. Creo que Brasil también está dando importantes pasos con las protestas anticorrupción que se están dando en Sao Paulo. Pero yo creo que todos los cambios empiezan con el individuo y con su mentalidad. Y ahí es donde yo vuelvo a la parte de apostar por la educación. Yo no vengo de un país donde el populismo gobierne, o sea, no tenemos el socialismo del siglo XXI implementado, pero sí tenemos populistas de todas las ideologías, y aunque no tengan ideología, igual son populistas. Entonces, yo en la radio, desde hace 10 años que hago radio, lo que siempre le digo a los jóvenes es, olvídate de que el gobierno te quiere educar. El gobierno te quiere tonto, te quiere miserable y te quiere dispuesto a votar por ellos, que te van a venir a vender que tú eres tan miserable y tan poca cosa que los necesitas a ellos para salir adelante. Entonces, agarra la tecnología, busca becas si no tienes plata para pagarte tu educación, y busca a través de la tecnología cómo empoderarte y acceder a información. Yo creo que el mayor enemigo del populismo es el ciudadano informado, el ciudadano que cuestiona y el ciudadano que participa. Entonces, lo que tenemos que lograr es que si hoy por hoy tenemos una herramienta que aglutina toda la información de la humanidad, debemos aprovecharla, porque mucha gente dice, es que el Internet no le llega a todo el mundo. Es verdad, pero va a haber un día donde va a llegar. Como la tele se tardó 50 años en ser mundial, la radio se tardó también más de 45 años en ser mundial, y los periódicos igual, el Internet va a llegar a un punto donde su acceso va a ser mundial. Pero ¿qué pasa hoy con el joven que ya tiene acceso a Internet y no lo está utilizando ni para empoderarse, ni para educarse, ni para denunciar la corrupción de su gobierno? A ese joven hay que enseñarle a usar ese aparato, porque ya hubiera querido Hitler tener GPS para saber dónde iba a ser el día D de Normandía, o ya hubiera querido cualquier emperador romano o Napoleón tener un smartphone que les dijera cuál era la mejor condición climática. Es decir, hoy por hoy, un ciudadano viviendo en uno de los barrios más marginales de América Latina, en una favela, tiene acceso a una información que reyes y emperadores y la gente más millonaria y rica hace 25 años no tenía. Y ese es un gran poder, porque como repito, yo creo que la verdadera pobreza es mental, no material. Y cuando hay pobreza mental, entonces sí, todo está perdido. Y eso es lo que están tratando de hacer estos regímenes populistas, acabar con la riqueza mental del ciudadano que psicológicamente se siente capaz de sacar su vida adelante. Entonces yo creo que nuestra primera primer trinchera es nuestro perfil en Facebook, nuestra cuenta de Twitter, nuestro correo electrónico. Y si a través de esa trinchera empezamos a mandar mensajes, entonces cambiamos incluso la percepción y la información que le llega a la gente que está a nuestro alrededor. Hoy por hoy cualquier ciudadano tiene incidencia en más de 3,000 personas a través de sus contactos de teléfono, de sus contactos de correo electrónico. Si cada uno nos hacemos conscientes de que somos células de información para 3,000 personas más, ese efecto multiplicador puede lograr que el debate de ideas le gane al debate populista. Claro, por supuesto.
Bueno, antes que nada, realmente me siento tan orgullosa de tenerlas aquí y tener el placer de conocer cada uno de ustedes.
And to have the pleasure to know each one of you personally. You're spectacular. I thank
Gloria,
you for your knowledge,
todas son
Gloria.
importantes,
You're
pero
all
Gloria,
important,
realmente
but
tú eres
Gloria,
el futuro.
truly, you're the future.
Y estoy tan feliz
And
de
I'm
saber
so
que
pleased
existe
to
una
know
mujer
that
como
there's
tú,
a woman like
porque eres
yourself,
una mujer sin
because
fronteras,
you're a
que
woman that
puedes,
knows of
con
no
tu
borders,
labia
that
increíble,
with your
la
speech,
pasión y la
incredible
inteligencia,
speech, the passion
se
and
ve que vas a poder
intelligence, one
atravesar
sees
las
that
barreras
you
del
will
mundo
be able
entero.
to
Eres una
cross
mujer
all
del mundo.
barriers in the
So, te
world. You're a
felicito
woman
y
of the
felicito a
world.
cada una de
I
ustedes.
congratulate
Pero
you and I
esa mujer
congratulate
millennium, yo
each one
creo
of
que
you,
se
but I think that the
personifica en ti.
millennium woman is personified in yourself. Thank you.
No sé si fue reconocida anteriormente, pero Bettina Rodríguez Aguilera, la muchacha que acaba de hablar, fue una de mis colegas en la ciudad del Doral. Ella fue concejal y ha hecho mucho para los derechos humanos en Cuba y ha sido partícipe de la fundación hace décadas. Así que gracias por estar con nosotros el día de hoy. ¿Alguna otra pregunta para concluir este panel y para que Frank y Pedro vengan a concluir la conferencia? Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you, everybody.
Bueno, para mí ha sido un día bien bonito.
Creo que
he aprendido tantas cosas que yo sabía, pero me las refrescaron. Muchas gracias a todos por asistir a esta conferencia que ya ha llegado a su conclusión. No sé si se podrá, José Luis, tomar una foto de todos los panelistas ahí con las banderas acá y eso, para tener un recuerdo del evento. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos. De verdad que ha sido un día pero extraordinario para mí y para todos nosotros aquí. Gracias.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the moderators and all the panelists for their participation. This was really a treat for us here at FIU at the Latin American Caribbean Center. I'm not sure we've done this in the past. But as I was telling our colleagues in the foundation, this is not going to end here, right? This is not an event that we have and then we sort of close the book, put it in the shelf, and we go to the next program. So the commitment I am making and will make with the foundation is to do a follow-up on this. Both in terms of communicating what's been said here through the taping and other social media tools that we have. And we do want to follow up on a number of the topics that were raised here. And I hope that we can count on all the panelists to help us, right, as we move forward in advancing this important project. So again, once again, thank you. Again, I want to thank Pedro and his staff, the foundation, for allowing us to host this is a partnership, as I said earlier, that does not end here, and that we look forward to continuing the work together. And then, there's a lot of people to thank, and obviously my staff, but there's two people that I really want to thank, and if everyone allows me. First, Sally, who is not here, of course, she's working outside, who from my staff, who did really yeoman's work in helping me with this project, and all the things that you see here, trust me, it wasn't because of me. And then, of course, I want to thank Karina. Where are you, Karina? Everyone needs to stand up and applaud. she, as I said, a lot of people were involved, and Sally did a wonderful job, but the thing that Karina did was really extraordinary. I can't go into all of it because I'll be here for about 20 minutes, but Karina, thank you so much. It was great working with you. And thank you all for being here at FIU, and please keep coming back because LAC continues doing all kinds of programs and activities. Thank you all.